Hi guys, welcome to Origin. What do you know? I find the time to shoot a video and there's chainsaws and hammering going on in the background, so try to ignore it. So the last proper video I did, forgetting that text video put up a few days ago, was kind of like a beacon which attracted the full wrath of the libertarian and anarchist communities on YouTube. I first want to make a clarification because I think a lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people didn't quite get this point. Just because I said taxation isn't theft doesn't mean I think it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing either, but taxation is not theft was the extent of my argument, and it was mostly semantic. Ultimately, that's a very minor argument to have. The big issue, which I didn't get into in this video, is what I want to get into in this one. Can all the services that are provided in our current society be provided in an anarchist society? Can they all be provided by a free market? Now, one guy that I was in an argument with linked me to tons of resources about anarchism, and one which is particularly relevant to this video is an ebook called Practical Anarchy by, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, Stefan Molyneux. See, one of the things that came up in our discussion was, can an anarchist society actually work? Can it provide all these services? So I was linked to this particular book, and it outlines a possible anarcho-capitalist society. If anyone does want to read it, I'll link it in the description. Obviously, I'm not going to address every point in the book, because then this would be a few hours long, and I don't have that much time. First thing I want to say is it strikes me that the book is aimed at anarchists. In other words, it's preaching to the choir. It doesn't strike me as a book that's trying to, talk to anyone who doesn't already believe that the government is immoral. The book hammers that point home in pretty much every page. So we'll start with that. The government is immoral because it necessarily uses violence in order to, run the country. Now, ultimately, if our fundamental moral philosophies differ, then we're probably never going to agree. But this particular philosophy strikes me as lacking nuance. It really comes across to me that violence is absolutely never okay, except in self-defense cases, when it's absolutely unavoidable. To explain why I don't agree with this philosophy, I'm going to use the current healthcare problems in America. See, before Obama passed his extremely watered down healthcare bill, the situation was that private insurance companies were excluding people on the basis of having a pre-existing condition. So just as an example, let's say someone had type 1 diabetes. They would need insulin for the rest of their lives. Now, if they weren't already with a private insurance company, that's a pre-existing condition. They know they're going to have to keep paying for it, so the profitable thing to do, the thing that makes the most economic sense, is to just not insure them. And that's what happened. And the result was, I believe it was something like 50 million Americans were uninsured. Now, here in the UK we have something called the NHS. Basically, we pay for everyone's healthcare in the form of tax. Our taxes go towards providing a universal healthcare system so that if someone does get ill, if someone has a heart attack or something, they can go to hospital and they don't have to pay anything right there and then. I have to be careful with my words because I know a lot of people are going to say it isn't free because it's paid for in the form of taxes, but you get the idea. You don't have to pay anything when you're actually there. It's not like when you have to check out, you have to go to a reception desk and pay a certain amount of money or something like that. It doesn't work like that. Now, is the NHS perfect? Definitely not. But we don't have the problem of people being uninsured. Anyone, however ill they are, can access healthcare. But anarchists would object to it because it's provided by the state. We pay for this healthcare system by paying taxes, so we don't have a choice not to pay those taxes unless we want to go completely off the grid and live like a hermit. Just a thing about the barrel of a gun scenario, by the way, that only applies in countries with armed police. And even then, the only time you would be shot is if you try to defend yourself with a gun. And even then, in my opinion, a competent police officer would shoot to wound, to disarm you, instead of try to kill you. And even then, why could it not just be chalked down to a single case of police brutality? But anyway, the private insurance scheme in America has meant that 50 million Americans, or something like that, are uninsured. That, to me, is immoral. So to me, the issue is trade-off. Do you go with the government-run healthcare system that provides healthcare for everyone, but they take those taxes by force? Or do you go with the private insurance scheme, which doesn't provide healthcare to everyone, but might be better at what it does for those that are insured, and no force is involved? I'm biased, of course, because I live in the UK and I've dealt with the NHS a few times, but I would definitely go with the NHS. It's as simple as that. When it comes down to government violence versus citizens' health, I go with citizens' health. Secondly, I think some parts of the book have been quite dishonest in how they talk about government-run systems. For example, public education in America. There's this one line where it says before public education was officially adopted in America, the literacy rate was 90%. Far better than it is now. Now, I researched that bit myself. The 90% figure is true, but results vary in terms of what the literacy rate is now. Depending on where you look, it looked like it was between 80 and 99%, but neither of those numbers are, well, far worse to me than 90%. A 10% difference isn't a huge difference to me. But none of that matters anyway because it ignores the literacy rate of every other country which has a public education system. For example, our literacy rate here in the UK is 99%. Which is 9% higher than that 90% figure quoted before the public education system in America was adopted. And anyway, quoting a statistic without providing a rationale for why that might be the case is pretty meaningless. Government systems of all sorts vary in terms of how well they're run. So a badly run government system doesn't necessarily mean that all government systems are going to be that bad. There needs to be a causal link, and one wasn't provided in the book as far as I could see. Now, how would services be provided in a stateless society? Well, the book makes the case that if enough people are concerned about a certain issue, say providing education for children, then they will provide it simply out of the fact that that concern exists. They'll give it in the form of either charity or some private insurance scheme or something like that. The book said if you're prepared to pay for that education, then your concerns are baseless because, if you're prepared to do it, then you're going to pay for it, so what's the problem? Well, what about everyone else? Let's say I am prepared to pay for someone else's education. That doesn't mean my neighbour is, that doesn't mean the rest of my family is. You see the problem? Even if I am prepared to pay for their education, it's perfectly legitimate for me to wonder whether other people are going to. And those are perfectly legitimate concerns to have if they're not going to. And it also said if you're not prepared to pay for that education, then you're a hypocrite for even raising the issue. But what if you are willing to do it but can't afford to? Is that person a hypocrite as well? People are always going to deal with their own problems first. If I'm starving, I'm going to spend my money on food. Paying for the education of children in the country isn't going to be high on my priorities list in that scenario. Now, I want to talk about what, in my opinion, was the worst thing in the book. It made the argument that there wasn't an example of a successful slave-free society before slavery, but they still outlawed slavery because it's immoral. So in the same sense, it doesn't matter whether there's an example of a successful anarchist anarchist society, you still outlaw the government because it necessarily uses violence and that's immoral. That argument is completely ridiculous because you're going to have a slave-free society before you have a society that uses slaves. No, the lack of slavery is the default position. You know, did hunter-gatherers have slaves, for example? Secondly, the outcome of outlawing slavery was completely predictable because people already formed businesses and people already worked for other people. All you had to do was just extend that scenario to the slaves. But in terms of an anarchist society, that simply doesn't apply. You're talking about a society that's 100% private sector. And certainly to my knowledge, there's never been a society like that. I'm not sure how long this video is, but this is going to be the last point I want to address in the book. And it's this concept of DROs, Dispute Resolution Organisations. This is what effectively replaces the police in a stateless society. How it works is quite complicated, but I'll do my best to try and explain it. Let's say that you want to borrow money from someone. The person that you want to borrow money from goes to the DRO and gets some insurance for the contract. If I fail to pay back that money, the DRO pays the person back. Now, if you have a history of not paying back money, the DRO will refuse to insure the person you want to borrow money from, and that implicitly tells them that this person isn't very trustworthy. So basically, decision insurance. Now that's just one example, but obviously it has to apply to every possible crime. I can't really... There's no way I can really be fair in this video to the anarchist position because you kind of need to know everything about a DRO to assess whether or not it can possibly work. Which is why I encourage people to look at the book in the description and see for yourself. But my worry is that the DROs will go the same way as the American healthcare insurance companies. Now, the book makes the case that because of how everyone's incentives interact, you'll naturally end up with a society that just works. But so far that's all in theory, and people aren't necessarily rational. I would support someone trying out the idea of a DRO if it's possible. And I know that anarchists would probably have a problem with that because it would involve having to pay taxes. But there's bound to be someone out there who understands fully the concept of a DRO and is willing to try it out, even given the fact that you would have to pay taxes for it. After all, if you do it, it can only be beneficial to your position if it works. But until you have a working example of something like this, so you can point to it and say it works, then to me it seems irresponsible to advocate for something like this. When I made the Venus Project videos, I always said they should be allowed to test out their idea, they should be given the opportunity to test it out. Same with the DROs. You know, I strongly support you setting up a DRO, someone setting up a DRO and testing out the idea. And if it doesn't work, you go back to the drawing board and try again. So to end the video, you know, I spent the last few months trying to understand where you guys are coming from, and I do see it. You know, I understand you believe that the government is immoral, you know, in principle, so all governments are immoral. But I could only ever support the system which you offer as an alternative if it provides for the poor, it doesn't pollute too much, there's a minimum of crime in general, especially violent crime, and you don't end up with the kind of problems you have in America with the healthcare system. If a society just can't achieve that, then to me it's more immoral to support that than to support a society which might have some immoral elements. And in case it comes up, if your attitude is people are poor, well, tough, then we have nothing further to discuss. It's as simple as that. Any society should actively try to solve every conceivable problem. It doesn't matter if it can't solve them all, it should try to. Anyway, I'm done now. Thoughts always welcome in the comment section below or in a video response, whatever you feel like. Thank you for watching, goodbye.